There you've got a lovely pink water lily about to come out, and the yellow one. Now they started to just slowly work their way around the pond.
A garden pond provides a special kind of peace, an escape from the busyness of life, offering you the chance to zone out and immerse yourself.
It's surrounded by greenery, but that's not the main story for me. The main story for me is what's going on in the water.
Welcome to Waterlands, a series brought to you by WWT. I'm Megan McCubbin, a zoologist and conservationist, and in this series we're going to take a journey together through some of the richest habitats on Earth. Ponds are incredibly special places. Although some may be small, they are always teeming with life. Ponds are home to far more biodiversity than lakes or rivers, and the beautiful thing is, you're never very far away from one. There's ponds in our parks, our nature reserves, our towns and cities. They are the perfect place for us to dip into the special relationship that we have with water. And that's especially true of our garden ponds. I've just stepped outside, out through my back garden door, past my bird feeders, which is filled with sunflower hearts and birds singing their hearts out in the surrounding bushes. And my garden pond is quite small. It's only about 1 metre by 1 metre, but it is one of my favourite places in the garden to come and sit. And I'm just as excited today to visit it as I was when I was 2 or 3 years old, going to the garden pond that I had in my parents' house, just thrilled to look and be nosy at all the life under the water's surface. When you're a kid, and this was certainly the case for me, watching frog spawn develop into tadpoles, and then of course watching the tadpoles develop as they sprouted legs, it was almost like a magic trick unfolding before your eyes. That initial fascination, it really gets you hooked, and it certainly was the case for me. And this is why I developed this fundamental love for ponds and pond life, because you never know what you're going to see. Sadly, the reality is that our wetlands are shrinking as the climate crisis continues to tighten its grip. This is why habitats, like our humble garden ponds, are more important than ever. And just as we look after them, they can help take care of us.
The bottom of the pond is another foot underneath this. This is the shallowest bit. And there's just a mass of greenery here.
This is a story about how a garden pond can play a healing role in our lives.
You will find things in it you didn't know you had. We've had grass snakes swimming across it. Just beautiful the way they curve through the water and bash the pondweed aside.
Henry Slator's house perches on a hill, about 3 miles from the Cornish coast. He's built a little bridge across the pond, leading to a tiny island with a bench on, a perfect place to sit and watch.
Although our house overlooks the sea, we have fantastic views of the sea, seawater doesn't seem to be the same as fresh water. The variety of life that is actually under a calm surface always astounds me. Whenever I visit the pond, even if I'm feeling really happy with life and everything, it always makes me feel that little bit more happy. I think that's what the pond does for me. Lifts me up.
The pond's special place in Henry's life became clear to him in early 2020, when he opened a letter from the hospital following a routine test for colon cancer.
They found a few spots of blood or something not right, sent me some pamphlets, and the pamphlets said there's only 10% chance that it'll be anything serious. So I thought, well, that's fine. I'm fit and healthy. I haven't smoked for ages, don't drink much. So I went in there and then did the colonoscopy, and the man doing it said, you have a cancerous growth, which you can actually see on my screen. And it was just a huge shock. And the 1.5 hour drive back from the hospital was very quiet. They cut away, obviously, the cancer inside the colon. It's about the size of an apple core, but they cut away quite a lot of the surrounding muscle and lymph. One of them had a minute area of cancer. So they recommended chemotherapy, and it just felt a bit surreal sitting there in a ward a couple of hours to actually fill me up with this toxic substance. My arm started feeling as if it was on fire. I was very nearly in tears. It was just so uncomfortable. I got home feeling absolutely awful, to be honest. No puff, no desire to do anything, and feeling pretty sick at the same time. Queasiness was with me for 3 weeks, but it would start off horrible, and by the 3rd week I actually felt, I won't say back to normal, but I could do things. And then I'd had this sort of cloud hanging over me, a mental anguish, I think, knowing that at the end of the 3rd week I had to go back. There was a certain amount of courage to fight it, because I need to fight it. And there was a certain feeling of, oh God, is this ever going to end?
As Henry is suffering terribly, COVID arrived. The trips to the hospital became even more daunting, and Henry's isolation and dark moods intensified.
And, it was quite terrifying. I had to get out, I had to do something, and that is where the pond came in. Probably the first day I felt strong enough to actually get there was the day that I realised this is what I need to do. I feel so much better.
There's growing scientific evidence about the benefits of being around watery spaces, improving mood and reducing stress. Being around ponds can help alleviate many of the burdens that the pressures of modern life brings. And the benefits appear to be even greater than when we spend time in purely green places. A study of 16,000 people across 18 countries found that frequent trips to watery nature decreased mental distress. The light, soundscapes, changing patterns on water, and meaningful personal connections with these settings may all contribute. Just 10 minutes spent in urban wetlands can be enough to improve a person's mood. Personally, I have always been drawn to the water. I find it calming and intriguing at the same time. It can really help put the world into perspective.
Some days I couldn't even manage to walk down here, and it's only 130 paces from the house. But I would come down here, come across the bridge, sit on the bench, and just imagine what was going on under the surface. I wonder what the dragonflies are doing today. I wonder what the frogs are after. That just made me forget how miserable I was and how weak I was and how incapacitated by chemotherapy. Coming to the pond every day was my way of recovering.
You can visit garden ponds throughout all seasons and find joy, mystery, and all kinds of wildlife spectacles. There is always something to marvel at. To discover the seasonal secrets of a garden pond, I'm joined by Sarah Davies from WWT.
Coming into spring, frogs and newts find the ponds again. Newts will actually do these amazing courtship displays under the water, which you can see at night with the torch if you're very lucky. Tadpoles will start to develop, so you might start to see them swimming around. Early flowers will be starting to bloom, which will bring in pollinators to your pond, and the aquatic vegetation will also start to re-establish. Rafting plants will be forming over the top of the pond, and newts like to lay their eggs in the leaves of the water forget-me-not, wrap them up and seal them to protect them from predators. Hedgehogs, birds, bats will start to visit the pond to drink or to start eating the insects that will have started to emerge. And then summer, you start to see absolute thrum of activity, lots of sights and sounds around your pond. It'll be buzzing with life. Damselflies and dragonflies doing some really lively displays above your pond.
Oh, you keep catching up. He's so cute.
It's a great time to go pond dipping. There'll be loads of pond creatures like water boatmen, pond skaters, diving beetles.
Garden ponds are fascinating worlds in miniature. There is so much to see, even in the smallest ponds. Even in a pond the size of a washing up bowl, animals and insects will sense this new body of water in their environment and be drawn towards it. They might register the water as they fly overhead, a slight change in sound, or a flash of reflected sunlight perhaps. Or they may smell the pond, or even hear the soft buzzing and splashing of tiny insects which have already discovered it. Right from the moment you build a pond, things will start to arrive. It's like a miracle when a small piece of space in your garden, which was once a plastic pond lining and bare rocks, slowly becomes overgrown with lush vegetation and transforms into a home for insects and tiny mammals, swimming and buzzing around. To discover how it happens, let's take a trip to the beautiful freshwater ponds at the London Wetland Centre.
Flippin' heck! Look at that! That is one of Britain's rarest dragonflies. Norfolk hawker has just come into this little pond and it's flying around, occasionally perching. It just chased a red admiral butterfly. I don't know whether it was thinking it was food. Now continuing its beat, its territorial patch around this pond. This is such a rare dragonfly, an endangered species that has started to spread with the warmer climate we're experiencing. It has the most beautiful green eyes, which gives it its alternative name of green-eyed hawker. I mean, isn't this just amazing?
Stood on this bridge is Dave Smallshire, author of Britain's Dragonflies and a long-time member of the British Dragonfly Society. The perfect person to explain how any pond can attract fantastic wildlife.
Been over 30 years since I first put a pond in my garden, and I can remember the great interest over the first few weeks as things started to appear. So some animals find their way to garden ponds by wings. Many of the bugs that turn up, whirligig beetles for example, they fly in, they find water, they can see the reflections of water. Other things may walk. The frogs, newts, the toads come in under their own steam and discover your pond.
As well as frogs, pond skaters and birds of all kinds, a garden pond might attract toads, newts, bats and hedgehogs. If you're really lucky, your pond might be visited by a tawny owl, a grass snake or even a kingfisher. It depends partly on the vegetation, the size of the pond, whether it's shaded or sunny, but whatever the pond is like, there is always something fascinating to look at.
I'd like to specifically mention dragonflies because it's a fantastic way to attract really colourful, interesting species into your own garden. The garden pond of a decent size should be able to host at least half a dozen different species of dragonflies and damselflies. So things like the azure damselfly, the large red damselfly, the blue-tailed damselfly, and then probably also the southern hawker and the common darter. And in the early stages, when your pond is very new, then almost certainly a broad-bodied chaser. So these are very good at finding new waters. They fly around looking for new sites. And I think if you dig a hole in the ground in May, fill it with water and stand back, there's a good chance within minutes you'll have a broad-bodied chaser on territory there. We have about 40 species of dragonflies and damselflies in Britain. I can see some lovely azure and common blue damselflies, bright blue matchsticks that fly out over the water. So the damselflies are the smaller, weaker flyers generally. They hold their wings together over their backs when they rest. Dragonflies tend to be larger, more powerful flyers and will hold their wings out at right angles when they're at rest. So as larvae under the water, where they may spend a year or two or even longer, they will be feeding on small organisms, anything up to the size of tadpoles and small fish. When they emerge from water and fly around for a few short days or weeks, then they're also aerial predators, and they will be taking anything with wings, catching small aphids and midges and mosquitoes, anything up to the size of a butterfly.
Seeing a dragonfly snatching a butterfly in mid-air and consuming it whilst flying is an incredible sight, but the dragonflies of today are nothing compared to their ancestors. It's believed the largest insect that has ever lived was a dragonfly with a 75 centimetre wingspan, which weighed as much as a crow. Imagine a few of those helicoptering down into your garden. That's a sight I'd like to see. The biggest ones today aren't quite so fearsome, but are still remarkable. They are the fastest insects in the world. Some tropical species can reach speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. They are the most effective predators on the planet, with a 95% catch rate, much greater than a lion, polar bear, or even a cheetah.
Dragonflies, on the face of it, are actually doing pretty well at the moment. Dragonflies love this hot weather. Those that don't like it, of course, are the ones that have to live in the water that's dried up, so they are going to suffer as a result of a hotter climate, which is why ponds are really so important for dragonflies and a whole host of other insects that you barely notice.
I love watching dragonflies darting around ponds, and I've always adored their name, the dragonfly. These insects have been revered in mythology and given all sorts of fantastical names over the years. Some of the early names include horse stinger, which is odd because they don't have a sting. Another one is devil's darning needle. The story goes that if you fall asleep by a stream on a hot summer's day, the dragonflies would use their long, thin bodies as needles to sew your eyelids shut. A fascinating myth, but don't worry, humans are perfectly safe. I've had many naps by my pond and can confidently say that this is not the case. I always wake up with my eyes intact. And if you fancy a snooze by your garden pond, well, I'd highly recommend it. As we're dreaming about the pond and all of its life, let's move from the network of ponds at the London Wetland Centre with its damselflies to discover what happens in a garden pond when summer has run its course and the night draws in.
As we get to autumn, the plants start to die back again. Newts and frogs will start to think about getting ready to overwinter, so they'll be feeding up on lots of pond insects. If you've got a tree over your pond, then you might start to see leaf litter accumulating on the top of your pond, and some of that will sink down to the bottom and be used by caddisflies to make their cases, or provide a source of food for shredding creatures like mayflies.
Back in North Cornwall, Henry Slator is still sat on his bench, looking into the water of his garden pond, carefully watching the activity. That's where he was when he was undergoing chemotherapy, and what he saw in the water began to work on his imagination.
I would be absolutely knackered sometimes. But to get over this horrible feeling, I start inventing stories. You can watch it today, it's just got a few ripples on it, but underneath there's this battle going on for eat or be eaten. I thought, what if I met a really large water beetle? What would I talk to it about? And for some reason or other, that then became water skiing. Well, how about having a water skiing championship? People who are sabotaging various competitors. You have to have a fish to tow the water beetle. I had to make it entertaining, because that's what I wanted, because I was feeling rubbish.
Henry's stories became increasingly elaborate.
The pond supplies endless possibilities.
And a bigger project, a book, Conversations at the Pond, began to take shape in his mind.
I was about 25, 30 when I started writing as an amateur, as a hobby writer. And I've never written about animals or insects. That's where the enthusiasm for the pond came even greater than it already was before my surgery or whatever. I would come down here with a pad of A4 and my pencil, and it was absolutely delightful and uplifting to have some of these quite daft stories about discussions with the inhabitants of a pond. I mean, there is a pond orchestra, and the Beatles play the strings instruments. Suddenly, there was an urgent yell behind me. "Harriet!" As I turned, there was a frantic stampede off the island to reach water, or to go under cover for the slower movers. I looked to the sky and its few clouds and around the pond. Nothing. All I noticed was the flash of green and blue as the male emperor dragonfly continued his incessant patrol over the pond's surface. When I was feeling good and would come back, I would then sit down with the writing, because I was feeling a little bit better. mentally and physically better, to get a sequence of events that was believable to a reader.
I tried to think of a threatening species beginning with the letter H. It's Harriet Heron, said the pampas grass, quaking at the name. Of course, a heron's diet covered most things in and around a pond. Frogs, toads, newts, fish, beetles, snails, eels, all could be snapped up by the wickedly long beak of this swift, striking, stealthy, long-legged predator.
The book is self-published. And once I finished it, I thought this might sound a bit big-headed, but I thought this was really good. I really enjoyed doing this. The pond's inhabitants also give us humans a bit of grief by telling me that they're a bit upset about the way the planet is going, the way their pond is going, the way diversity is being diminished.
If anything, I become more curious of my garden pond during the winter months, when species are adapting and surviving the hardships under the ice. It's amazing to think how these important plants and animals thrive as the ice forms and locks everything in. Sarah Davies is with me again to explore the chilly winter months in the life of a pond, and give us some tips on creating a garden pond for all seasons.
A lot of the aquatic plants have started to die back under the surface. So things like water lilies will actually have sunk, and their leaves that were floating on the top of the water will have dropped to the bottom. A lot of underwater invertebrates, beetles, water boatmen, they dive all the way to the bottom of the pond, and they actually become dormant over the winter period. Amphibians, such as frogs and newts, they'll be sheltering outside of the pond at this time under rocks, mud or compost heaps. You occasionally will get a frog that will burrow to the very bottom of a pond and stay there over the winter. There's plenty of oxygen in cold water, so most things under the surface are still completely happy. But if you have fish in your pond, for example, and it does get very frozen for a long period of time, that might start to reduce the amount of oxygen. So what you can do is place a ball on the surface of your pond before it freezes over in the autumn, and that will provide a clear patch so that there's plenty of oxygen getting into the pond, and it also means that animals that might be coming to your pond to bathe or drink can still do so.
And I always say to people, there's more drama in our garden ponds than there is on something like EastEnders. Honestly, just go and watch it throughout the course of the seasons and you never know what kind of activity you could see.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why these ponds are so important. They increase the biodiversity in our gardens substantially, don't they?
It's probably the best thing you can do for wildlife in your garden is to create a pond.
And do you think over time we've seen an increase of garden ponds? Have more people been putting them in, do you think?
We know that overall, since the 1900s, the number of ponds generally have declined. There are now about 500,000 ponds in the countryside, but they did a study of small garden ponds, which often aren't included in those estimates. And they think there could be between about 3 and 4 million garden ponds in the UK, which is a really, really substantial number. I think in recent years, there's definitely been a rise in people creating them, which is a really good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that more people are engaged with building ponds, because sometimes you think a pond is quite a complicated habitat, and in order to put one in, you need a lot of space and a lot of resources to build it. But it can literally be as simple as putting in a washing up bowl. There's lots of different ways of doing it.
Absolutely. And really nice example is a barrel pond. So if you don't have any lawn at all, you can just source a barrel, get some baskets, which will go into the barrel, and fill that with aquatic soil and plant them up. And, you know, within a year, you'll have a lovely, thriving pond. Yeah, doesn't need any sort of traditional garden setup at all.
I've never thought of a barrel before, but why not? Why not fill a barrel full of water and put it on top? I always used to get my goggles on and put my head just in the surface just to try and get a glimpse of any nymphs or something darting around to see what was going on. But that's me, I'm naturally nosy. And I had the best time the other week just watching the dragonflies emerge. And they were crawling out as the sun was setting, and it was beautiful to watch them come out of their casings and dry off and fly off eventually. And I felt so much calmer, and the peace was just stunning.
I really like the summer months in the evenings, hearing things like the swifts flying overhead as well. It all just adds to that kind of really tranquil feeling, being in a really peaceful environment around a pond.
Suddenly waking up to cancer and with going through the grimness of chemo, I now appreciate even more what I've got. And the main item in that is nature. And the nature around the pond is just the bee's knees for me. It's just, the pond is the thing that, it becomes my favourite place. It might not have been before I was ill, but it certainly is now. The thing I'm most mindful about is I love all these little guys under the water. I love the birds and the bees, but I have to look after them. The number of ponds has reduced dramatically, which means all this wonderful action that I'm seeing on my pond, it's no longer common. If you can build your own pond, you should be fascinated after a short while as to how much is going on in there. Water is the mainstay of life.
It's great that more people are coming to realise the benefits a garden pond can bring. And the more we can provide, the more chance we have of saving our miraculous biodiversity. And we'll be helping ourselves too along the way. So I'm hoping the number of garden ponds will continue to grow. For more information on garden ponds and for more fascinating nature stories, sign up for emails at wwt.org.uk and follow WWT on our socials. Waterlands is an 1860 production for WWT. The producer is Melvin Rickaby.